lost city lies hidden in the emerald jungle of Honduras. The enigmatic carvings of its ancient Maya builders guarded their secrets for 1,000 years. We thought they whispered of gentle stargazers. But now the code lies broken, and the hieroglyphs shout tales of bloody wars and human sacrifice. Who were these people, and what disaster drove them from their mighty city?
I'm John Rhys-Davies. Join me as we unravel the mystery of Copan, next on Archaeology.
In 1839, lured by rumors of a fantastic lost city, American explorer and diplomat John Lloyd Stevens hacked his way into the thick mountain jungles of Honduras. The rumors hinted of a great Maya city, full of great monuments and strange carvings, built and then abandoned long before the white man set foot on New World soil. But even the tall tales he had heard could not prepare Stevens for the ghostly presence that loomed up before him.
It lay before us like a shattered bark in the midst of the oceans. Her masts were gone, her crew perished. All was mystery, dark, impenetrable mystery.
What sophisticated race had built the elegant city which lay before him, still nearly intact? Where had they gone? Most perplexing of all were the strange, chaotic carvings that adorned the temples. Were they some sort of language? But here, as at other Maya ruins, their mystery remained impenetrable. The carvings defied translation, just as the pyramids resisted explanation. Stymied scholars resorted to imagination, sketching a picture of the Maya as a peaceful, contemplative people thriving under the watchful eye of wise astronomer-priests.
The scholars were wrong, dead wrong. Today's archaeologists working in the jungles of Central America have come to know a quite different Maya. They've cracked their code and the ancient peoples have found their voice again. In the once mighty city of Copan, hieroglyphs speak of war, blood ritual, and human sacrifice. Who then were these people? And what apocalypse brought their great dynasty to its knees?
When I walked among its temples, I did not see a pile of stone, but I thought, Washaklahun Ubah Kawil built this. He dedicated that ball court. And I began to understand all of those works, not as the relics of a dead civilization, but as the fossils of the human beings, the minds of the people who had created them. Copan came alive.
When Linda Sheely first walked into the jungles of Central America back in the late 1960s, Maya scholarship was in its infancy. The Maya had tamed the rainforests, growing corn and cacao beans, much as their descendants do today. They built great cities at Tikal, Yaxchilan, Chichen Itza, and Palenque. They traded in precious stones such as jade, fashioned some of the finest sculpture in the New World, and built pyramids to rival those of the Egyptian pharaohs. Beyond that, there was still much to learn. Scholars had resorted to a wishful thinking that spoke more eloquently of their own times than those of the Maya.
From the period of the 1930s up through the 60s, the great scholars of the time, Morley, Thompson, and others, characterized Mayan society as having basically two groups of people, a whole bunch of peasant farmers who supported a very tiny elite who spent their lives contemplating the stars and time and living in ceremonial centers that were filled once or twice a year during ritual festivals. The picture that was drawn of the Maya is that they never had war, they never disagreed with each other, And one wonders how they got close enough to each other even to reproduce themselves through the common human means.
People clung to that idea tenaciously, and I think part of the reason for that is they were reacting to all of the excesses and the maladies of Western culture. You have to remember that their context was that of 2 world wars, where literally the whole world was involved in a deadly conflict.
They wanted a peaceful people. They wanted to know that someplace in the world there was a human community that lived without war and competition.
For 15 years, archaeologist Bill Fash and his colleagues have continued and expanded excavation techniques that allow them to reconstruct the monuments even as they dissect them. In the past, archaeologists at Maya sites had no choice but to dismantle the grand monuments, layer by layer, to get at older structures obscured by the more recent ones. But at Copan, the archaeologists have created a delicate labyrinth of tunnels through the ruins, leaving them virtually intact.
Since the building of the Acropolis was a matter of layers upon layers upon layers, or as some have commented, it's like boxes inside of boxes, the easiest way to get from one to the next is by the tunneling. The world of the tunnels is like 3-dimensional. And it's very different because you can go up, down, or sideways. You can move in every direction.
If we had to do a traditional archaeological excavation of the Copan Acropolis, we'd have to destroy half of everything we dug. But with tunneling, we're able to just do surgical strikes. It's as if we're doing arthroscopic surgery, and we can just go in there with just very small excavations to exactly the point we want and get a maximum of information for a minimum of disturbance to the archaeological site. The tunneling's been vital to understanding the history of ancient Copan. We have the hieroglyphs that tell us about the kings, but the tunneling tells us about the buildings that were constructed by each of these rulers.
We were one day away from giving up here. We had found the cut, and I took one look at it with my flashlight, and I could see femur fragments and some of the shell and the 2 stones, and it just clicked immediately that it was not only this huge chamber, but that it had to be something very important.
Through the tunneling, we've discovered a part of the offering that is actually placed above the tomb. This was a big surprise. We didn't think we were going to find any human figures here. It's the largest tomb we've ever found in Copan.
Clearly, these were the tombs of noblemen, perhaps kings, but their identities remain a mystery. If there are clues to the dead man's identity, they likely reside in the walls of Copan's monuments, in the hieroglyphs that for so long remained obstinately silent. But only in the last few years has the language come alive. For the first time in a millennium, classic Maya can be heard among the jungle ruins. And what is being spoken has radically altered our view of the people who wrote on these walls.
We went from talking about empty ceremonial centers which held only priests, basically, and people living in little hamlets on the outsides who would come in on Sunday to peddle their corn, to some large urban centers, to understanding the fact that these cities, like Copan, was over 20,000 people living with the same kind of pollution that we get today in our cities. We now understand that the Maya were really much more like everybody else's. They're much more human.
They were much more human than we had imagined them. With the breaking of the Maya code, the picture of these people as peaceful stargazers crumbled. The great kings of Copan led their people in bloody battles against their neighbors.
We know that the Maya were like any other, quote, civilized group of people. They had a lot of war. They had a lot of conflicts with their neighbors. They were always jockeying for position to see who could be the biggest and the most powerful ruler of his time. To be a great and virile king, you had to go out and impose your will on somebody else by the use of force. You can see this in the depictions here on this figure. There are upside-down human heads, shrunken heads actually, that are trophy heads, that are the bounty of war. You can even see the ropes that they used to tie these heads together.
The hieroglyphs tell again and again of human sacrifice and self-mutilation. But to the Maya, they ensured continuation of their cosmos.
The most sacred substance was human blood, especially a king's blood. Led in auto-sacrificial ritual was the greatest gift that a king could offer to the gods and to his ancestors. There are a number of sites where child sacrifices have been found. It was thought that the baby's tears would bring the rainwater from the sky. So a lot of sacrifice was oriented toward fertility, toward ensuring that the natural cycles took their course and that the harvest would be bounteous and the people would be happy.
There are two great acts that kings consistently presented in the public forum. One is the taking of captives. The other is the taking and the offering of the king's own blood in ritual sacrifice taken from the most sacred areas of his own body. For a male, the genitals. For the female and the male, it's the tongue. It's the place where human beings reproduce themselves and the place where speech is made, where meaning is communicated from one person to another. Bloodletting was the central act of piety. Now why? One kind of soul is called chulel. It is a sacred living substance that is in our bodies that is never destroyed. It's passed on from you to future generations. That kind of soul resides in human blood. So that when kings give victims of war in sacrifice, or when they take blood from themselves, they are all giving the most potent and the most important, valuable substance on the face of the earth. Our culture says the same thing. What do we say? Greater love hath no man than he give his life for his brother.
Bloodletting marked each celebration in the calendar and each rite of passage in the life of the Maya. The birth of a child, the consecration of a temple, the preparation for battle, and the thanksgiving for victory. Even Maya sport was fraught with cosmic importance. Copan's magnificent ball court, one of the best preserved in the Maya world, witnessed intricate morality plays in the guise of athletic competition.
The ball was seen to represent the passage of the sun in the sky, and much of the ball game was oriented toward ensuring the safe and timely passage not only of the sun through the sky, but of the moon and the planets and so forth.
The ball game is the fundamental metaphor of what life was. In this myth, two hero twins go to the other world. There, they confront the lords of death. Disease, starvation, warfare, all of the confrontation is played out in the ball court.
The king dressed up to play ball, embodying the forces of good, and he faced players who were dressed up to embody the forces of evil. So that when the king would defeat those people, he was in fact defeating all the things that could hurt his people.
In this competition of life over death, the losers sometimes paid the ultimate price.
Oftentimes there are very clear depictions of the sacrifice of ball players. In fact, sometimes they even bind the losers up as a ball and show them being rolled down steps just like these. So we do know that some people were sacrificed in order to ensure the victory of the forces of good ended in the sacrifice of a loser.
For hundreds of years, the blood pact between the kings of Copan and their subjects seemed to have stood them in good stead. Copan flourished. By 600, Copan and her sister cities were unrivaled centers of art and learning. From among the 15,000 works of Copan art collected here in the last decade, art historian Barbara Fash finds the works created during 18 Rabbits' reign particularly beautiful.
The buildings may have served a function that was utilitarian, but the iconography on the outside of it, the sculpture that was being produced at that time, just raised it to an artistic, aesthetic height that is really unprecedented in Copan and in many other places in the Maya area.
In the history of the Renaissance, not very many people know the name of the Pope Julius, but Julius was the man that commissioned Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo to leave us one of the greatest artistic heritages of the West. 18 Rabbit was the great patron of Copan, and he hired, commissioned, and gave the room to work to some of the greatest artists the Mayas ever had.
18 Rabbit ruled for 43 years. His sculptures, replete with themes of fertility and abundance, speak of a period of peace through strength, giving no hint of the disaster to come.
18 Rabbit is in the guise of First Father, the maize god, and he is the creator of the universe. He and his wife, who was the moon and First Mother, wear the netted skirt. That whole myth is contained in the life cycle of a piece of a maize tree. The little seeds that are put in the ground are called skulls and little bones. And when the maize tree sprouts from the ground, it's the rebirth of the maize god, and it's the rebirth of humanity, because that is the last act before the creation of this universe.
In 738, an aging 18 Rabbit set out on one more conquest to do away with a troublesome neighbor. He was captured and beheaded, an earth-shattering blow to his people. This is the great hieroglyphic stairway of Copan, begun not long after 18 Rabbit's gruesome death. The longest and most ornate inscription in the New World, the Grand Stairway records the complete history of the Copan dynasty. Its magnificent present testifies to a society quickly recovering from the blow of a great king's death, but the excavations reveal a more ominous story.
One of the most telling things about this monument is that even though it makes all these wonderful and grandiose claims, it was actually one of the worst constructed buildings in the entire city. The fill underneath this magnificent facade was the weakest they ever put inside of a building in Copan. That lets us know that the people who were building this pyramid were not nearly as enthusiastic about its message as the king who commissioned it.
As more and more kingdoms established themselves, they wanted their piece of the pie. And it led to a lot of internal strife that often was resolved in battle.
So first we see a weakening of the central order. Second is the actual collapse of the monarchical system of government. And that's literally all she wrote. There are no more monuments going up in Copan.
Copan had gone from a thriving, peaceful center of art and commerce to a valley of desperate people struggling to feed themselves. For physical anthropologist turned forensic detective Rebecca Story, the bones of Copan yield a grim prognosis.
Most of them probably died of the results of the overpopulation. That is, malnutrition and infection worked together to kill many children, and even the adults that survived eventually ended up dying of the effects of infection. By the time this individual was there, the population of the valley was probably in steep decline.
Some 20,000 people were hungry or sick in the valley of Copan. How could it have happened that this thriving metropolis was reduced to this?
They set up the city on the most fertile agricultural lands, down on the bottomlands that the river had carved out and made fertile over the centuries. By doing so, they were basically cutting off their own food supply. They weren't able to farm the best lands. They were then obliged to cut down the forest on the slopes. In doing so, that caused erosion. As they had to cut back even higher up, this made for deforestation on a large scale that prevented the rain clouds from coming into the valley. And they provoked the collapse of the central authority first, but they also provoked the long-term abandonment of the valley because people simply couldn't get enough to eat here anymore.
The evidence suggests that the city grew rank with its own waste, that there was not a tree standing within 25 miles, and that the overworked soil could not begin to feed the hungry multitudes who lived there. Copan had become a victim of its own success.
For nearly 1,000 years, the kings of Copan upheld a blood covenant with their gods and their people. The Maya prospered. They built great monuments, deciphered the heavens, created objects of great beauty. But when their world began to collapse, even the blood of kings could not forestall disaster. In just a generation, the monarchy stumbled. Soon the great city would lie empty, reclaimed by the jungle.
Most of us who deal with the Maya think Maya civilization either ended at the collapse in the 9th century, or it was destroyed by the Spanish invasion. But in fact, there are millions of Maya who still live in this worldview. It's still alive, it's still active, it's still incredibly productive. And what they have found is that the actions of their lives have roots that go back 3,000 years. And for our people who have been told that they are the ersatz leftover folk Catholic product of a European power, and that they have no value in themselves and they have no history, to have the glyphs put back in their hands is a miracle. And they say it is.
Today, with the hieroglyphs pouring out their stories, Copan is yielding a rich human history.
It's important to recognize and absorb the fact that one of the oldest, continuous, and most detailed written histories of the human species is Maya, and it is written on those stones.
You feel attached to the bones that are here, you know, you feel attached to the monuments that are here. They're ancestors, you know, they're still a part of our history, you know, and we're not excavating somebody else's, we're excavating our own history. This is of significance to our own people. It's unraveling the roots of our nation. I was only going to be here for a year, and I've been here 15, so to say how long, I think I'm going to stay for a long time. Copan is in my blood.
Thousands of mysterious mounds like these dot the southeastern United States. For centuries, their ghostly presence mystified all who laid eyes on them. Who could have built them? Surely not the sorry savages that the historians of the 18th and 19th centuries assumed the native population to be. A lost race, perhaps, which had come and gone before the first white man set foot on the New World, consigned forever into the oblivion of prehistory. Over the past decade, archaeologists have traced the route of the conquistador Hernando de Soto, searching for clues as to how the Indians may have perished. This painting in the Capitol building shows that romantic visions of the conquistador continue to celebrate the explorer's arrival on the American continent. But research tells a darker story.
Driven by the mysterious disappearance of the mound builders, archaeologists are retracing the footsteps of the great conquistador Hernando de Soto. At digs throughout the southeastern United States, they cast new light on de Soto's route, revealing a trail marred by signs of human carnage.
By the time de Soto set foot in Florida, he was a wealthy, seasoned veteran of Spanish ventures in the New World.
De Soto himself had come to the New World when he was about 14, was a big success in the terms of the day as a conquistador. He participated in the pillaging of Native American societies in Central America. He was involved with the Pizarro brothers in the sacking of the Inca Empire. He became quite wealthy.
But wealth alone could not satisfy de Soto's burning ambition. To leave his mark on history, he would gamble his fortune on one more throw of the dice, his own expedition in search of El Dorado.
When they came to the New World, none of the conquistadors came with the intention of staying. They wanted to come over here, they wanted to find El Dorado, they wanted to find the gold of the Incas, and if they didn't find that, they would go back without any kind of entitlement, any kind of status. And so they knew that, again, their backs were against the wall to make a name for themselves in the New World. And people had done it before, and there was no reason to think that they couldn't do it too.
Having plundered the great wealth of the Inca Empire, the Spanish turned their eyes northward. From there came rumors of gold, silver, and gems beyond the imaginings even of the greatest Inca monarch. In fact, a few precious trinkets had been taken from the natives of the north, but in one of the great ironies of history, the conquistadors would never learn of the true source of that wealth, their own shipwrecked galleons.
late 1530s. Wealth was going back on Spanish fleets. Many of those fleets set sail from the coast of Mexico, came around the Gulf, went down the Gulf Coast of Florida and through the Strait of Florida and up. Some of them wrecked, summer storms, hurricanes, and the Florida native peoples salvaged material off there, gold, silver, and in Florida archaeological sites and native sites, we do find gold and silver that came right out of Central and South America.
Spectacularly oblivious to history's strange twist of fate, De Soto's proud conquistadors arrived in the New World in the spring of 1539, probably at Tampa Bay. Almost 700 strong, they set off with haste in search of their fortunes. When they stopped to ask directions, as it were, they were in no mood to be trifled with.
Every time De Soto came to a new place, he would interrogate his captives, and the two main questions were, where is the greatest prince in the land? Where can I find the greatest, biggest, wealthiest society? And he also specifically asked Indians about precious substances such as gold and silver. The Spanish would show the Indians the jewelry on their fingers and on their bodies and would ask the Indians, where can I find this? Where can I find that? The Indians may have been tempted to mislead him, and in some cases we know that they did. But for the most part, I suspect they told him what he wished to know because his means of extracting it were so great, and the possibility of torture was so obviously present.
In keeping with his charter from the king, De Soto read a lengthy statement to each group of natives he encountered. They and all their lands now belonged to the Spanish crown, he informed them. They were to pledge their allegiance to Spain and accept the Catholic faith.
Should they refuse, it came with this warning. With the aid of God, we will enter your land against you with force and will make war in every place and by every means we can and are able. We will take you and your wives and children and make them slaves, and we will take your property and will do you all the harm and evil we can.
His so-called legal grounds for waging war established, Hernando de Soto set about the business of destruction and enslavement with a clear conscience. Though they came to the New World ostensibly for gold, God, and glory, the Spaniards also quite clearly came in search of slaves.
They brought leg irons and collars and chains to enslave the Indians. Probably during most of the expedition, they probably had as many Indian slaves as they had members of the expedition. So at times, the expeditions probably they had as many people as 800, 900 people, including all the Indian slaves that were accompanying them.
One tactic used by De Soto was to capture the chiefs. The chiefs were not only economically and politically important, they were also the focus of their people's religious life.
It was devastating to the local populations when the Spaniards captured the chiefs because it just paralyzed everyone. The population was brought to its knees almost immediately. And the reason for this is because the chiefs were the ideological centers of the universe. It was their cosmological point of contact with the other world. And why is this important? It's important because the chiefs, through their ideology, could communicate with the knowledge of the ancestors in the other world.
Until recently, our most informative sources about De Soto's Odyssey and the Indian cultures he encountered were the records and diaries kept by members of his force. Archaeologists decided to pick up the now cold trail of his expedition using these accounts.
There are actually 3 first-hand accounts written by participants in the De Soto expedition. They give almost a day-by-day itinerary. What we do then is to take those accounts and look at our maps and try and find those locales. Where is a big lake? Where is a big village? And so on and so forth. And in this way, sort of like a detective works, take a lot of little bits of information, put them together, sort of see what the best fit is. And this is how we begin to reconstruct the route.
Looking for evidence of the Spanish, archaeologists reasoned, would be the best way to find the remains of lost Indian cultures.
Within archaeological sites, we're going to see evidence at some of them of the impact of the Spaniards on the native people. And in fact, at several sites along the route, we see very graphic, horrendous evidence. Indian bones, the remains of people that lived in 1539 that have been cut with Spanish weapons.
One of the important contact sites in Florida is called Tatham Mound. Archaeologists found the remains of nearly 300 individuals, most of whom died at the same time. The cause of death was grimly clear.
But included in this group of people were bones that clearly showed sword cuts through them. One horrible one, the left shoulder of an individual cut all the way through, probably just cut the whole right arm of a person off. Some of the long bones, when the Spanish fought, it was typical for them to try and cut the tendons and muscles in legs, so your opponent fell down, and then go in and cut them in the wrist, so they dropped their weapons and then go in and give them the coup de grace, either on the head or whatever. Clearly, people were killed because of these little battles, little skirmishes that occurred.
The accounts also reveal that the Indians fought just as violently as the Spanish. The witnesses record horrifying scenes. The Indians ambushed their enemies so cautiously and skillfully that not a single Spaniard who strayed so much as 100 yards from the camp escaped being hit by an arrow and beheaded at once. And in spite of great haste our men made to assist their companions at such times, they always found them decapitated.
But the Spaniards had devastating weapons at their command.
They had crossbows, they had arquebuses, they had cannon. I think good weapons. I think the best weapon, however, was the horse. And repeatedly, when the Spaniards were endangered, mounted knights on those horses could simply rout an Indian force. Essentially, a knight on a horse was the Sherman tank of the day. He had his sword, his armor, his attack dog, his war horse, pretty much impenetrable, and could attack Indians, and simply with horses, charge into them, defeat them, kill them.
The basic weapons of the Indians would have been war clubs and bows and arrows, and to some extent maybe spears, which I don't think was used very much. The weapons of the Spaniards, on the other hand, the combination of the men mounted on horses with lances and dogs was devastating.
On horseback, the Spaniards literally let slip the dogs of war.
The Indians couldn't outrun the horses, and they couldn't outrun the dogs. These dogs were war dogs. They were Irish wolfhounds, they were mastiffs, and they were greyhounds, and they were trained to kill people.
But you have to understand that De Soto and his army were here to do a job. They were here to explore, conquer, and settle. And they would stop almost at nothing to do that. Their lives were at times endangered, so they did whatever they had to do. By our standards today, their behavior was often extremely cruel.
On October the 18th, 1540, it appeared the Indians had had enough. They planned an elaborate ambush to end the Spanish terror once and for all. At the village of Movila, Chief Tuscaloosa staged an elaborate surprise attack against De Soto and his army. The Spanish slaughtered the Indians where they stood. It was a bloodbath.
The eyewitness accounts tell the tale. Women and even boys of 4 years of age fought with us, and Indian boys hanged themselves not to fall into our hands, and others jumped into the fire of their own accord. The arrow shots were tremendous and sent with such a will and a force that the lance of one knight was pierced by an arrow. We killed 3,000 of the vagabonds, without counting many others who were wounded and whom afterwards we found dead. After the battle, we rested there for a month, and we burned over much of the country.
Movila was a turning point, a death knell not only for the native people, but for De Soto's waning hopes of gold.
After Movila, De Soto, as one of his chroniclers said, began to waste life, and I think that meant life, the life of his own army, and especially the life of the Indians. And it was because he smelt failure. He smelt failure of his expedition, and he smelt ruin. He pushed his men very hard, and most particularly the Indians. And this became even more extreme in 1542 in the last months of his life, when he must have known that everything was gone, everything was lost. And at this point, he began to attack the Indians with great savagery. He would wage a kind of melee action against a village in which he would order his men to kill everybody. And the purpose was to inflict terror on any Indians who happened to hear about this incident.
Despite the advanced weaponry and savagery of the Spanish, the Indians might have prevailed had it not been for a more insidious adversary: disease. As the conquistadors marched west, they also spread deadly diseases. Epidemics that led to immense population declines spread throughout the 16th century southeastern United States.
The question of irrevocable population loss is most clearly seen, I think, in the lower Mississippi Valley, where I've done a lot of archaeological work. When De Soto comes through in 1540, there are approximately 80 villages, large villages, between like Memphis, Tennessee, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. De Soto passes through, stays there 4 or 5 months, but then passes on through. And there is no further European contact until 1682, when La Salle, representing the French, come down the Mississippi. He records only 5 villages. So the question is, what happened? What happened to the other 75? They disappeared, they died, and they likely died of disease.
As the expedition moved forward, the people and the animals they took with them, the horses, dogs, and pigs, transmitted new diseases into the susceptible native populations, and they in turn transmitted them to others.
If you think of the United States, take a major city and you reduce it by, say, 98 to 99%, you'd have an idea of how devastating it was to these societies. When they emerge, that is, when these societies, we see them through the eyes of the early English and French explorers, the whole fabric of society is completely different. These are very, very different people.
Is it possible that warfare, even between the Native American tribes, could have caused this depopulation?
The question of warfare versus disease and depopulation is an important one to look at. There's several lines of evidence that we use to say disease versus warfare. First of all, 16th century warfare is very primitive. And there may have been individual instances like Mabila, where population was wiped out, but everybody else is intact. Those are individual towns that were destroyed. Okay. With disease, however, because disease can spread between people, you would have greater destruction across a larger area of space. And wherever De Soto spent large periods of time, people disappear. And there's no way that warfare, 16th century warfare, can do that. 20th century nuclear warheads can do that, not 16th century warfare.
The depopulation of the local Indians in this area was dramatic. And one reason that it happened on such a large scale was that when people in a town were sick, everyone was sick at the same time, apparently. And so even if a glass of water would save your life, there was no one to go out to the local lake or river, get you a glass of water so that you could survive. And so having everyone sick at the same time, there was no one there to go out and gather herbs, people to go hunting, bring back game, and the villages could have had minor illnesses, and most people could have starved to death.
Within 30 years after the expedition, many of these native societies also changed. There were great social and cultural upheavals in the southeast.
Florida Indians, of course, unfortunately, simply died out, and by about 1730s and 40s, literally what had been several 100,000 native peoples was down to handfuls. And Creek Indians from Alabama and Georgia, who had been raiding into Florida even in the late 1600s, began to move down in and establish settlements. About 1740, they would continue to do so, but those Creeks, who the Spaniards often called cimarrones, or runaways, because they had left their native homes, later became the Seminoles, or the Seminole of today. And so indeed, Florida was repopulated, at least in part, by Native American Indians, and the Seminole, their descendants, of course, live here today.
You not only have the collapse of the human population, which was certainly very important for the maintenance of the society, but you also have a tremendous loss of information. If you have 98% of your population dying, you may have a couple of percent of the population surviving, but what if all the medicine men die? What if all the shamans die? What if your people who hold the esoteric knowledge, which is important for communicating with the other world? What if all of these people die? Then you have some real problems. You lose that continuity of knowledge.
What was here in the 17th century was very different from what was here in the 16th century. For some of the Indian peoples that De Soto encountered, the Usita, the Mocoso, some of the others in Florida, our only mention of them and our only information comes from archaeology and from what the De Soto expedition tells us.
De Soto died penniless in 1542, presumably of fever, as his army camped on the banks of the Mississippi.
For nearly a century after De Soto's death march, refugees crisscrossed their emptied homelands. New tribes and languages emerged. The collective past was lost. And by the time the English and the French colonists had laid eyes upon the mounds and asked, whose monuments were these? The descendants of the mound builders had forgotten. Only today, with the help of archaeology, are they reclaiming their lost past.
Vikings. The word calls up images of giants, grim warriors and fearless sailors capable of bravery and barbarism in equal measure. They hailed from the Scandinavian countries now known as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The bleak, mountainous interiors of their homelands made them an outward-looking people from the start. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, they began pushing their longboats out from the fjords, scanning the horizons for precious land and sources of trade, and terrorizing the hapless Europeans who stood in their way. For more than 500 years, they swept into Europe, east, south, and west. The westward-looking Norwegians would move stepwise across the Atlantic, from the British Isles to Iceland to Greenland, and finally to a mysterious place called Vinland, somewhere in America.
Every schoolchild knows that the rogue Viking Leif Erikson set foot in the New World long before Columbus's historic voyage. But until recently, just how the Scandinavians managed this navigational feat remained a mystery. The questions persist. Did they try to colonize the Americas? And how much of their seafaring skill did they bequeath to medieval Europe?
Well, the more I've sailed in these small, after all small and open ships, the more respect I've gotten for these people. They were extremely brave. They must have been very, very clever shipbuilders, sailors, navigators. They must have been very well organized, and I mean, they were fantastic.
Ragnar Thorseth, adventurer from Norway, knows the seafaring ways of the Vikings as intimately as anyone. For the last decade, Thorseth had dedicated himself to building replicas of Viking ships and sailing them round the world.
What we have been interested in is to learn as much as possible about the ship, seaworthiness, speed, and of course to learn how to sail them, so that we better can understand how it was possible for the Vikings to not only to sail once across the North Atlantic, but to cross it regularly 1,000 years ago.
The archaeology of boats is a relatively new frontier in the science of the past. Working with scholars from the Viking ship museums in Norway and Denmark, Ragnar has tried to remain as faithful to the original Viking shipbuilding craft as possible.
What is unique for Scandinavian shipbuilding at that time is the clink building technique. Most ships today the planks are like this, but the Viking ships, it's more like this, and then they are nailed together. And first you build up the ships with the planking, and then later on you put in the ribs, while in most other traditions they do it the opposite way.
Thorseth's fleet consists of replicas of 3 ships. Gaia, a copy of the largest Viking ship yet found, built in 850 AD as a raiding vessel and probably once the property of a king. The Oseberg, a copy of a royal yacht dating from about 800 AD, is the most elegant of the Viking ships. The original was built for protected waters and never meant to see the high seas. The Saga Sigla, the most seaworthy of the 3 vessels, is an 11th century Viking trader.
Well, if I were to cross the North Atlantic again, I would go for the Saga Sigla, the Knar. But if I were to compete in America's Cup, I would go for the Gaia. Beautiful, fast ship, really.
The story of the Vikings' expansion is intimately connected to the characteristics of the land they inhabited, the conditions that drove them outwards. Europe was helpless against the pagan horde. Wielding axes and swords with gruesome skill, the Vikings knew no reason to spare civilians, women, and children from their attacks. They ventured as far south as Spain, perhaps even sailing occasionally into the Mediterranean. In the 9th century, they grew strong enough to sack London and lay siege to Paris. They settled parts of Ireland, northern England, and conquered the city of York.
Well, I think we've completely revolutionized people's idea of the Viking era in York. People used to think of the Vikings coming and just destroying the city, but we've seen a picture where they come and they inject new life into the place and they lay it out with the streets and the properties and the churches and the buildings, which you can still see today. The lines of the properties still exist 1,000 years after, but they have their origin in the Viking Age. So the Vikings came as traders and as merchants, and they gave York new economic life.
From there, they struck out ever westward. The Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland. In the process, they became learned seamen.
We are pretty sure that they were able to establish the latitude they were on, and that they would follow the latitude. We are pretty sure that they had a sun compass to help them establish the latitude. We also know that they were well familiar with the planets, with the stars. For instance, the polar star, they called that the leading star, so they would always know the true north. And of course, anytime when it was clear weather, they would have the sun and the moon and the other planets. The problems, I guess, came up when they for many days had bad weather and couldn't see the sky. Then they could get lost, but that was actually a good thing too, because the first man to get a sight of Greenland, he was lost, and also the first man, according to the tradition at least, to get the sight of Vinland or America. He was in his way from Norway to Greenland and he got lost in a storm, and so
Our source for those westward journeys are two sagas, both of which tell of the volatile clan of Eric the Red. Theirs is a tale of discovery driven by violence and exile. Eric's father, exiled from Norway on charges of manslaughter, took his family to Iceland. Eric himself, exiled from Iceland after several fights and killings, set off in 986 to settle on the island of Greenland. Eventually, the colony would grow to several thousand settlers. It conducted brisk trade with Europe for several centuries.
Greenland was a rich country. It had many resources which Europe wanted in the medieval period. Things as prosaic as walrus hide, which were used for ships' ropes, through things as mysterious as narwhal tusks, which throughout medieval Europe was considered to be the unicorn horn, the horn of this sort of very mystical and mythical beast. The main commodity, however, was ivory. And walrus ivory from the tusks of the walrus that lived in more northerly waters of Greenland was the main form in which tributes and various tithes were paid to Europe by the Greenlanders.
The Vikings continued to look westward across the Atlantic. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, one Bjarni Herjolfsson was driven off course while trying to reach Greenland and sighted North America in 986. He did not go ashore, but he carried the knowledge of the continent back to Greenland. In about 1000, Eric the Red's son, Leif, decided to strike out for the mysterious westward land to see if it might be suitable for colonization. According to the sagas, Leif's expedition first happened upon a barren landscape backdropped by mountains and glaciers. Leif dubbed the place Helund, or Land of Flat Rocks. Scholars believe this to be Baffin Island. Sailing southward, they then pulled ashore on a wooded place with a gently sloping shoreline and broad white beaches. This they named Markland, or Land of the Forest. It was probably Labrador.
Then to the south of that was a third land, which they called Vinland. And this is the one that the questions are about. We don't know exactly where Vinland was, except that it was somewhere to the south of Labrador.
For years, scholars have debated the truth of the sagas and the location of Vinland, even the meaning of the term Vinland.
Mælti þá á norrænu stund leið, var gengin eigi miklu lengra. He spoke then the Norse language and said, I have something new to tell you. I found wines and grapes.
The name Vinland was given to the land by Leif Erikson in the sagas because, as he said, because of the good qualities that it has. Now, this has been a controversy in scholarship ever since because people want to, in modern days, see it as V-I-N with an accent on the I, Vinland, meaning land of wine or land of grapevines. But in Leif Erikson's time, they really had no knowledge of grapevines or wine. There was an Old Norse word, V-I-N without the accent, Vinland, which referred to pasture land. And in fact, any Norse explorer finding a new land would have had as his first priority to find pasture land. They lived on their cattle. They carried cattle with them in their ships as they went exploring. And their first priority was find a place for the cattle to graze.
Norse people would settle in a land where the old pattern of culture fitted. I mean, in Newfoundland, they would find what they were used to, hunting seals, hunting caribou, and all that stuff. And furthermore, it was very important to stop in time, don't sail too long, because I lived in the wilds for many, many years in the northern part, and the preparations for the winter, on that depends life and death. They had to build houses, they had to hunt, they had to fish, and prepare for the winter.
It was here, in northern Newfoundland, that the definitive evidence was finally found. Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Anna Stina Ingstad spent the better part of a decade sailing up and down the Atlantic coast of North America, looking for clues of the Vikings. In 1961, they arrived at Lance aux Meadows.
Dr. Ingstad is a Norwegian explorer, but his wife Anna Stina was the archaeologist. And they arrived in Lance Meadows by accident, really, and they met with the local spokesman of the community, Mr. George Decker. Dr. Ingstad asked Mr. Decker if there was anything unusual, any humps or bumps or mounds around, and Mr. Decker said, yes, there are some Indian campsites up by Black Duck Brook.
And there it was. Even if it was overgrown as it was, and it was made very clear that it was remains of old houses. But we didn't know, of course, who had built these houses. They might have been Indians, they might have been Eskimos, they might have been fishermen, it might have been whalers, and at last it might have been Norsemen. Only excavation could tell the story. But personally, I had a strong feeling from my experience in Greenland and in western part of Norway that this was a place that the Norse people would like to build their homes.
The Viking presence on North American soil some 500 years before the voyages of Christopher Columbus has now been definitively established at Lance aux Meadows. How is it possible, then, that such a monumental discovery would gradually fade from memory, that by the time of Columbus, the notion of sailing off the edge of the world would again lurk in the imaginations of European explorers? The answer? It probably didn't. In 1957, Yale University acquired a rather stunning map dating from the mid-1400s. On its western extremity appears the island of Vinland. 400 years after life's journey, and 50 before Columbus's. If authentic, the map proves that the reality of transatlantic crossing was still present in the minds of Europeans.
Part of the controversy about the Vinland map is the question of its provenance. There are speculations that it did actually come from a Spanish library in a private family library that was perhaps trying to avoid the Spanish regulation on exporting antiquities.
Indeed, the map raised such intriguing questions that several scholars sought a simpler answer. It was a forgery. And close examination revealed that the ink on the document contained titanium oxide, a chemical available only in the 20th century.
But I've shown a way that there could have been a transfer of this titanium dioxide into the ink in modern times as an accidental transfer during cleaning. In the mid-1950s, tissue paper of some manufacturer for a few years did contain commercial titanium dioxide, exactly the material that has been found in the map.
There is, however, reason to believe the map authentic. On the upper left-hand corner is inscribed a long secret message in code, a cryptogram.
The discovery of the cryptogram in the inscriptions of the Vinland map shows that someone went to an awful lot of trouble to incorporate these cryptograms in the inscription. One does not create a cryptogram hidden in an inscription except by an awful lot of very hard retrying work and just one change of one word in this inscription could destroy the structure of the entire cryptogram. For a forger to go to all the effort to incorporate two cryptograms in two separate inscriptions in the map is very difficult for me to imagine.
If the map is indeed authentic, it testifies that the Vikings had lost nothing of their navigational skills in the years preceding the momentous voyages of Columbus.
Columbus did definitely know about the Vikings and their voyages to North America. Remember that Columbus was born less than 50 years after the last Viking ship sailed from Norway to Greenland. We also know that Columbus was in Bristol when he was a young sailor, and Bristol was an important harbor, and they had lots of ships sailing up to Iceland and also to Greenland. So the Viking voyages, it was a living tradition. Some people also, or some science also say that Columbus went to Iceland, so he most definitely knew that there were land on the other side of the big ocean.
Greenlanders discovered or sailed to America. Greenland was colonized from Iceland, and so when we think America being found by Europeans, there were mainly Greenlanders who sailed from Greenland to the continent of America. We don't speak of Christopher Columbus in this country.
The Indians were there a long time before both Columbus and the Vikings, so the Vikings were probably the first Europeans in North America, but I mean they were there for a short period. Columbus, of course, opened up America for the Europeans.
It is too easy in this day and age to forget the true magnitude of the Vikings' achievements, to underestimate the elemental forces they challenged. But Ragnar Thorseth is not likely to forget. In May 1992, the valiant trader the Saga Sigla and the elegant royal yacht Oseberg foundered in a sudden storm off the coast of Spain. Luckier than their Viking forebears, the crew survived to tell the tale and to build and sail Viking ships once again.
What extraordinarily brave men they must have been, pushing their open longboats into the fjords of Scandinavia, setting sail for unknown, hostile lands. An epic saga in themselves, these voyages wrote a heroic prelude to the European age of discovery. Leaving one to ponder, will we ever know the extent of the debt that Columbus owed his Viking predecessors?